The radar screen flickered once, then twice, before going completely dark. Captain Nadia Voss stared at the dying display, her hands steady on the yoke of the Boeing 777 even as her pulse quickened. Below her, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, indifferent to the 185 souls aboard Flight 447. The cabin was silent except for the low hum of engines, passengers sleeping or watching movies, unaware that their pilot had just lost every navigation system simultaneously. No transponder, no radio, no GPS, just the stars above and an ocean that looked the same in every direction. She'd been flying for 16 years, but this was different. This felt deliberate. The co-pilot, Marcus Chen, a young hotshot who'd made his disdain for older female pilots abundantly clear during pre-flight, finally looked up from his own dead instruments. His face had gone pale. Nadia didn't acknowledge his panic. Instead, she reached for the backup radio, the ancient analog system that most pilots forgot even existed. Static answered her first call, then her second. On the third attempt, a voice crackled through, male and cautious, asking for identification. When she gave her airline and flight number, the voice went silent for almost 20 seconds. When it returned, it was different. Colder, more formal. They were being diverted, the voice said, immediately. New heading would be provided manually. No questions. Marcus finally spoke, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine fear. He asked if they should tell the passengers. Nadia shook her head. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening, but she already suspected. The timing was too precise. The electromagnetic signature too clean. This wasn't equipment failure. Someone had reached up from the ocean or down from the sky and wiped their systems deliberately. And now someone else was guiding them somewhere. The question was why. 20 minutes later, she saw them. Two dark shapes materialized from the clouds on either side of the aircraft, close enough that she could see the angular geometry of their airframes. F-22 Raptors. American. Their presence should have been reassuring. Instead, her stomach tightened. Fighter escorts didn't appear for navigation failures. They appeared for threats, for hijackings, for aircraft that needed to be controlled or, if necessary, eliminated. Marcus saw them too and swore softly. One of the fighters pulled closer, near enough that Nadia could see the pilot's helmeted head turn toward their cockpit. Then her radio crackled again. A new voice, younger than the first, with a West Coast accent. He asked for the pilot in command. When she identified herself, there was a pause. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. He used her old call sign, the one from another life, call sign Revenant, and he asked if she was ready to remember how to fight. The airline had made her promise to leave that life behind. 12 years ago, when she'd hung up her flight suit and accepted the commercial aviation position, they'd been explicit. The uniform came with conditions. No talk of the black operations. No mention of the missions that didn't exist in any official record. No acknowledgement of the 3 years she'd spent flying aircraft that weren't supposed to fly, in airspace that wasn't supposed to be contested, carrying people who weren't supposed to exist. Agreed because she was tired. Tired of the adrenaline. Tired of the secrets. Tired of being erased from her own history. But now, at 38,000 feet with fighters on her wings and a cabin full of civilians behind her, the past had just reintroduced itself with the subtlety of a missile lock. She keyed the radio carefully, aware that Marcus was listening, aware that every word was being recorded somewhere. She told the fighter pilot he had the wrong person. That Revenant had been retired. Decommissioned. The response came back with something that might have been amusement. The fighter pilot said that was unfortunate because the situation developing below them suggested otherwise. He provided coordinates, and when Nadia entered them into her backup navigation system, her breath caught. The position marked a spot 300 miles ahead in international waters, where, according to the encrypted data burst her cockpit had just received, a submarine had surfaced. Not American, not Allied. And it was broadcasting a signal that matched a frequency Nadia hadn't heard since her final classified mission, the one that had ended with 14 people dead and her psychiatric evaluation recommending immediate discharge, the one she still dreamed about. Marcus demanded to know what was happening, his voice cracking slightly. Nadia didn't answer him. Instead, She asked the fighter pilot for clarification on rules of engagement. Were they protecting her aircraft or hurting it? The pause before his response told her everything. Both, he finally said, until command determined whether she was an asset or a liability. The second fighter had moved directly behind them now, a position that made its purpose unmistakable. If she deviated from the provided heading, if she attempted to contact ground control, if she made any move that suggested hostile intent, that Raptor would put a missile through her tail section before she could finish the turn. Marcus had figured it out too. He asked, voice barely above a whisper, if they were prisoners. Nadia's hands remained steady on the controls as she made a decision that would define everything that followed. She told Marcus to take over primary controls. He blinked, confused, until she stood from her seat, removing her headset. He asked where she was going. She said she needed to check something in the cabin. A lie. What she actually needed was in the overhead compartment above her seat. The go bag she'd carried on every flight for 12 years. The one containing items that would get her fired if anyone discovered them. The bag was exactly where she'd left it, tucked behind her regulation flight manuals and emergency equipment checklist. Marcus was too focused on maintaining heading to notice her retrieve it. She moved aft, toward the galley between business and economy class, where the flight attendants were preparing the breakfast service. Lead attendant was a woman named Patricia, 60 years old, veteran of 30 years with the airline. She took one look at Nadia's face and stopped mid-motion with the coffee pot. Patricia asked if there was a problem. Nadia smiled the practiced smile of someone delivering bad news gently. She said there might be turbulence ahead and asked Patricia to secure the galleys early. Patricia's eyes narrowed. She'd been flying long enough to recognize when a pilot was lying. But she nodded and began stowing equipment. Nadia continued to the rear lavatory, locked the door, and opened the go bag. Inside was a satellite phone, military-grade, encrypted, connected to a network that officially didn't exist. She powered it on and waited while it searched for signal. 30 seconds, 45. Then a tone, one message waiting. The text was brief and in code she hadn't used in over a decade. But muscle memory was a strange thing. Her fingers moved automatically, decrypting the message using the key she'd memorized and never forgotten. The decoded text made her close her eyes and lean against the lavatory wall. The submarine wasn't random. The electromagnetic pulse that had killed her aircraft systems wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. Someone wanted Revenant back. Someone who knew exactly which flight she'd be on today. Someone who'd orchestrated an international incident just to put her in a position where she'd have no choice but to respond. The message ended with a question. Was she still capable? Did she still remember? Nadia looked at herself in the small mirror, saw the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during her military service, saw the gray threading through her dark hair, saw the face of a woman who'd spent 12 years trying to be normal, trying to be safe. She deleted the message and pocketed the phone. When she emerged from the lavatory, Patricia was waiting, arms crossed. The older woman said quietly that in 30 years she'd learned to read pilots. And whatever was happening, she wanted to know if the passengers were in danger. Nadia met her eyes and made a choice to trust. She said they might be, but not from what Patricia thought, not from mechanical failure or weather, from something else entirely. Something that required they trust her completely for the next 4 hours. Patricia processed this with the calm of someone who'd survived multiple emergency landings and one attempted hijacking. She asked what Nadia needed. The answer was specific. Nadia needed Patricia to identify any passengers who seemed wrong, anyone who'd boarded late, anyone watching the cockpit door too carefully, anyone who seemed prepared for something to happen. Patricia didn't ask why. She simply nodded and moved through the cabin, professional smile in place, checking on passengers with the practiced ease of her profession. Nadia returned to the cockpit. Marcus glanced up, relief evident. He'd been alone with the fighters for 10 minutes and his hands on the controls showed white knuckles. He asked again what was happening. This time, Nadia told him part of the truth. She said their aircraft had been selected for an intelligence operation. that the navigation failure had been induced deliberately, that they were being guided to a position where they'd observe something that certain people needed observed. Marcus processed this slowly. Then he asked the intelligent question. He asked if she'd known this would happen when she reported for duty. Nadia said no, but she said someone knew she'd be flying today. Someone had planned this around her presence. The fighter pilot's voice interrupted on the radio. He informed them they were approaching the designated coordinates, that visual confirmation would be required, that under no circumstances were they to deviate or attempt to contact anyone other than the escort aircraft. Nadia acknowledged and took back primary controls. The ocean below them looked no different than it had an hour ago, but she knew what to look for now. The slight discoloration in the water, the pattern that suggested something large and metallic just beneath the surface. Then she saw it. The submarine surfaced, water streaming from its hull. Russian designation, but the configuration was wrong, modified. The conning tower had additional structures, communications arrays that belonged to a different generation of technology, and on the hull, painted large enough to be seen from altitude, was a symbol she recognized, a chess piece, a raven, and beneath it Cyrillic letters that spelled out a name, her name, not Voss, her birth name. The one she'd left behind when she'd entered the witness protection program 23 years ago. The name of a girl who'd grown up in Moscow before her father had defected, bringing his daughter and his secrets to America. Marcus saw it too. He turned to stare at her, and in his expression was the dawning realization that his captain wasn't who her personnel file claimed. The fighter pilot's voice returned, quieter now. He said command was waiting for her response. That the submarine was broadcasting on multiple frequencies, all of them asking for revenant, all of them using authentication codes that only she would know. The authentication codes were from her childhood, before the defection, before America, before everything. Names of streets in Moscow that no longer existed, her grandmother's maiden name, the title of a lullaby her mother had sung. Things no intelligence agency would have on file because she'd never told anyone. Things that proved whoever was in that submarine knew her in a way that should have been impossible. Marcus had gone very pale. He asked in a voice that tried for steady and missed if she was a spy. If this entire flight had been some kind of cover. Nadia almost laughed. The truth was so much stranger than espionage. She told Marcus to maintain heading and altitude, that she needed to make contact, that what happened next would determine whether they'd be landing safely or becoming an international incident. She switched to the frequency the submarine was broadcasting on. The voice that answered was male, older, speaking Russian with a Moscow accent she hadn't heard in decades. He called her by her childhood nickname, asked if she remembered the winter of '98, if she remembered what her father had told her the night before they left. She closed her eyes. That winter had been brutal. Her father, a naval architect who designed submarine propulsion systems, had shaken her awake at 3 in the morning, told her to pack only what she could carry, told her they were leaving and could never return. She'd been 15, old enough to understand fear, young enough to believe her father could protect her from anything. She responded in Russian, voice steady, asking what he wanted. Why now? Why this elaborate theater with fighters and passengers and international waters? The answer came back immediate. Because her father's work hadn't died with him. Because the systems he designed were still classified by both nations. And because someone had begun building them again. Someone who shouldn't have access to those designs. Someone who was about to start a war. Nadia's hands tightened on the controls. Her father had died 8 years ago. Heart attack. Natural causes, at least that's what the death certificate had said, but she'd always wondered, always suspected that the secrets he'd carried had eventually come for him. The submarine commander continued. He said he was her father's friend, his colleague from the old days, that he'd been protecting her father's legacy. But that legacy was being weaponized, and only she could prove it. Only she knew where her father had hidden the proof. Marcus interrupted in English, demanding translation. Nadia switched languages smoothly. She told him the submarine commander was former Russian Navy, that he was defecting, that he had information about weapons systems that violated multiple treaties, that he'd chosen this method of contact because both governments wanted him silenced. The escort fighter's voice cut through, sharp and commanding. The American pilot said she was to cease communication immediately, that she was not authorized to negotiate with foreign military assets. That command was assuming direct control of the situation. Nadia ignored him. She asked the submarine commander what he needed from her. The answer was simple and impossible. He needed her to fly to a specific location, to land at an airfield that didn't appear on any civilian maps, to bring the evidence her father had hidden, and to do it before the people hunting him found what they were looking for. She asked how she was supposed to land a Boeing 777 full of passengers at a hidden airfield. The response made her breath catch. He said the passengers were why he'd chosen her flight. They were insurance. No government would shoot down a civilian aircraft with that many witnesses. No military would risk the international incident. The passengers weren't hostages. They were shields. Marcus was shaking his head, mouthing the word no repeatedly. The fighter pilot was demanding response, his voice rising. Patricia appeared in the cockpit doorway, and her expression said she'd heard enough through the door to understand they were in serious trouble. Nadia looked at each of them in turn. Then she looked at the radar display, still dark from the electromagnetic pulse. At the fuel gauge showing they had 4 hours of flight time remaining. At the coordinates the submarine commander had just transmitted, she made the calculation that every combat pilot eventually faces. The one where you weigh impossible odds against necessary action, where you decide if you're willing to bet lives, including your own, on your judgment. She keyed the radio to the fighter channel and spoke with the authority of someone who'd once commanded aircraft in situations that made this look simple. She told the fighter pilot she was declaring an emergency, that she had reason to believe there was a credible threat to the aircraft, that under federal aviation regulations, she had authority to deviate from assigned course to ensure passenger safety. The fighter pilot's response was immediate and cold. He said any deviation would be considered hostile action, that he had authorization to enforce compliance with lethal force. Nadia smiled grimly. She'd been threatened by experts. She asked the fighter pilot if he really wanted to explain to his superiors why he'd shot down an American commercial flight with nearly 200 souls aboard, in international waters, on camera, because she was certain that submarine had multiple recording devices aimed at them right now. The pause before his response told her she'd calculated correctly. Then a new voice came on the channel, older, more measured, American accent with Southern roots. He identified himself as Colonel Davies, Air Operations Command. Colonel Davies spoke with the weariness of someone who'd managed too many crises and had no patience for games. He said he knew who Nadia was, knew her service record, both the official one and the classified sections that had been sealed after her discharge. He said he also knew about her father, about the defection, about the technology that had brought both Russian and American intelligence agencies to an uncomfortable alliance. He asked her directly if she had any idea what she was stepping into. Nadia took a breath and answered honestly. She said she didn't, that she'd spent 12 years trying to leave that world behind, but that if someone was using her father's work to build weapons, she couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend she didn't have a responsibility. Davies was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. He said her father hadn't died of natural causes, that the official story was a cover, that he'd been eliminated because he'd threatened to go public about someone selling his designs to third-party actors, that the investigation had been buried to avoid diplomatic complications. Nadia's vision blurred momentarily. She'd suspected but never known, never had confirmation that her father had been murdered for his conscience. Davies continued. He said the submarine commander was telling the truth, that he had evidence, but that bringing him in required careful handling, that multiple governments wanted him dead, that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge. He asked Nadia what she intended to do. She looked back at Patricia, still in the doorway, at Marcus, terrified but listening, at the coordinates on her screen. She told Davies she intended to land the aircraft safely, to ensure her passengers got home to their families, and to get the evidence her father had died protecting. Everything else was negotiable. Davies made a sound that might have been approval. He said he was authorizing a deviation from course, that the fighters would escort her to a neutral location, that she'd be met on the ground by people who could sort this out without starting a war. But he warned her. He said the people hunting the submarine commander were sophisticated, that they had assets she wouldn't see coming, that once she committed to this, there was no backing out. Nadia acknowledged and began plotting a new heading. Marcus found his voice and asked what they were supposed to tell the passengers. Patricia answered before Nadia could. She said they'd tell them there was a medical emergency requiring diversion, that it happened sometimes, that everything was under control. Her tone suggested she'd brook no argument. Nadia appreciated the support but knew it wouldn't be that simple. Because in the cabin, among those 185 passengers, at least one person was reporting everything they observed. The satellite phone in Nadia's pocket vibrated twice, the signal that meant someone had just activated a tracker nearby. She'd planted 4 of them during pre-flight, standard practice from her operational days. Tiny devices hidden in lavatory panels and overhead compartments, designed to alert her if anyone accessed certain areas. Someone had just opened the overhead bin containing the auxiliary life vests, the bin that also happened to be directly above row 32. Patricia saw Nadia's expression change and asked what was wrong. Nadia told her to check row 32 without being obvious, see who was sitting there and what they were doing. Patricia left with the efficiency of someone who'd handled drunk passengers and medical emergencies and didn't rattle easily. Marcus was staring at the new heading Nadia had programmed. He pointed out that the course would take them within 50 miles of Chinese airspace, that if they deviated even slightly, they'd have a new set of problems. Nadia said she was aware. The fighter escort had adjusted position, forming up on either wing. The lead pilot, the one who'd first used her call sign, came back on frequency. He identified himself as Captain Ryan Hatcher, call sign Blade. He said he'd read her file, the unredacted version, that he knew she'd flown special operations missions in Syria and Afghanistan, that she'd earned her call sign by surviving a surface-to-air missile that had killed her entire crew, that she'd flown the burning aircraft 30 miles to friendly territory before ejecting, that the evaluation that followed had noted her refusal to abandon her position until everyone else was clear. He said he understood why Davies was trusting her judgment, but he asked her to understand his position. He had orders to ensure this aircraft didn't become a propaganda victory for hostile actors, which meant if she made the wrong choice, he'd have to make an impossible one. Nadia appreciated the honesty. She told Hatcher she'd do everything possible to avoid putting him in that position, that she wanted everyone to go home tonight, including the passengers who had no idea their routine flight had become an international incident. Patricia returned to the cockpit, and her expression was carefully neutral. She reported that row 32 contained a young man, mid-20s, Asian descent, who'd been in the lavatory 4 times since takeoff, who had no checked luggage, who'd paid cash for his ticket, and who was currently on his phone despite the aircraft's no-signal status. Nadia felt the familiar cold clarity of operational awareness settle over her. She asked Patricia if the man had noticed her observation. Patricia said no. He'd been too focused on his phone, typing rapidly, as if he was sending reports. The implications were clear. Someone on the aircraft was relaying their position and actions in real time, which meant whoever wanted the submarine commander silenced knew exactly where Nadia was going, knew she'd made contact, knew she was attempting to help facilitate the defection. She pulled the satellite phone from her pocket and typed a brief encrypted message to Davies, reported the surveillance, asked for guidance. The response came within seconds. Davies said to do nothing, to let the observer continue reporting, that intelligence agencies were tracking the communication and using it to identify the network, that interrupting now would burn the investigation. Nadia understood the logic but hated it. Her aircraft was being used as bait. Her passengers, those 185 people in the cabin, were now unwitting participants in an intelligence operation. Marcus had been watching her face. He asked quietly if they were going to be okay, if this was going to end with everyone safe. Nadia wanted to lie, wanted to give him the reassurance he needed. Instead, she told him the truth. She said she didn't know, that the next few hours would determine whether they walked away or became a tragedy, but that she'd done this kind of work before, that she knew how to navigate impossible situations, that she'd get them down. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised her. He said he'd listened to the other pilots talk about her, about how she was past her prime, how she'd only gotten promoted because of diversity requirements, how she flew too cautiously. He said he'd believed them, had thought she was just coasting to retirement. He said he'd been an idiot. Nadia felt something shift in her chest, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. She told Marcus that everyone underestimated women until it was too late, that she'd built a career on being underestimated, that the mockery had given her the freedom to be better than anyone expected. The fighter escort adjusted position again, and Hatcher's voice came through with new coordinates. He said they were being directed to an alternative location, that the original landing site had been compromised, that they'd need to fly lower under radar coverage for the final approach. Nadia acknowledged and began descending. The passengers would notice, would feel the change in cabin pressure. Patricia would need to make an announcement. Something about weather avoidance or air traffic control requirements. Something that sounded routine. As they dropped through 30,000 feet, the ocean below became more detailed. Nadia could see wave patterns, the occasional ship, and something else. Dark shapes in the water moving in formation. Submarines, multiple contacts. This wasn't just about one defector anymore. The submarine commander's voice returned on the frequency, speaking Russian again. He sounded urgent now, said they had company, that hostile forces had triangulated his position, that the window for extraction was closing rapidly. He gave new coordinates, a position 40 miles north of their current heading. He said there was an island there, abandoned research station from the Cold War, runway just long enough for a 777 if the pilot was skilled and fearless. Nadia pulled up what limited data she had on the region, found the island. The satellite images were old, but they showed a strip of concrete cutting through jungle. No lights, no support infrastructure, no indication anyone had used it in decades. She ran the calculations in her head: wind speed, approach angle, runway length versus landing distance, fuel remaining. Every variable screamed that this was impossible. Marcus looked at the same data and said what she was thinking. He said they couldn't land there, that the runway was too short, that even if they got down, they'd never get back up, that they'd be stranded with no way to get the passengers to safety. Nadia agreed with his assessment. Then she explained why they were doing it anyway. She told him about the submarines in the water, about how this had escalated from a defection to something larger, about how if they didn't land, if they turned back now, the submarine commander would be killed and whatever evidence he carried would disappear, and her father's murder would remain buried. Marcus stared at her. Then he asked the question that mattered. He asked if she was willing to risk 185 lives for personal revenge. The question hung in the cockpit like smoke. Nadia felt the weight of it, the absolute clarity of the moral calculation. She turned to face Marcus fully and told him it wasn't revenge, it was prevention. That if someone was building weapons based on her father's designs, people would die, not just on this aircraft. Thousands, maybe more, that her father had tried to stop it and been killed, that she was being given a chance to finish what he started. Marcus held her gaze. Then slowly he nodded. He said he hoped she was right, that he hoped this wasn't the decision that got them all killed, because he had a wife. 3-year-old daughter, another child on the way. He said he wanted to meet his son. Nadia felt the responsibility settle on her shoulders like physical weight. She promised she'd get him home, promised she'd get everyone home. Even as she made the promise, she knew it might be a lie. Hatcher came back on frequency with an edge in his voice. He said radar was showing new contacts, fast movers approaching from the west. He said they appeared to be Chinese J-20 fighters, that the situation was about to get very complicated, that he needed her to make a decision right now. Nadia didn't hesitate. She told Hatcher she was committing to the island landing, that she needed the fighters to buy her time, to keep the Chinese aircraft at distance until she could get her plane on the ground. Hatcher acknowledged with professional calm that didn't quite hide his concern. He said his wing would intercept, but that he needed her to understand that things might get kinetic, that shots might be fired, that international airspace was about to become very crowded with very tense people. The aircraft descended through 15,000 feet. Nadia announced to the cabin that they were experiencing a technical issue requiring an unscheduled landing, that everyone should return to their seats and follow flight attendant instructions, that they'd be on the ground shortly. The cabin erupted in anxiety. Voices raised. Questions shouted. Patricia and her crew moved through the aisles with practiced calm, securing passengers, checking seatbelts, preparing for emergency landing procedures. In row 32, the young man with the phone was typing frantically. Nadia watched through the cabin camera and wondered who he was reporting to, who was coordinating the response, who wanted the submarine commander dead badly enough to risk an international incident. The satellite phone vibrated again. New message from Davies. He said Chinese government was claiming the submarine had entered their territorial waters, that they were demanding its surface and surrender, that they were characterizing the situation as theft of Chinese military technology, that the narrative was being constructed to justify whatever came next. Nadia understood immediately. This wasn't about Russian secrets anymore. This was about all three governments claiming ownership of her father's work, about technology that had apparently been stolen and sold and stolen again until nobody knew who had legitimate claim. Her father would have hated this. He defected precisely to prevent his designs from being used as weapons, had spent his last years trying to ensure the knowledge died with him, but knowledge never dies. It just waits for someone desperate or greedy enough to resurrect it. The island appeared on the horizon, dark green jungle surrounding a gray strip of concrete. Nadia could see the runway was cracked, vegetation pushing through, could see the remains of buildings at one end, could see that Marcus had been right. This landing was going to be everything wrong with aviation in one concentrated moment. She told Marcus to prepare for manual landing. No autopilot, no precision approach, just eyes and hands and the kind of piloting that got people killed when it went wrong. Marcus's hands moved across the controls, his earlier fear replaced by focus. He'd trained for this. They all trained for this. But training happened in simulators with reset buttons. This was real. The Chinese fighters appeared as dark specks to the west, closing fast. Hatcher and his wingman moved to intercept, their Raptors accelerating with the kind of power that made physics seem negotiable. Nadia listened to the radio chatter as the American pilots positioned themselves between her aircraft and the approaching threat. The communication was professional but tense. Warnings issued. Airspace claims made. The diplomatic language of people preparing to kill each other if necessary. She tuned it out. Focused on the approach. The island was growing larger and she could see the runway was even worse than the satellite images suggested. The concrete had buckled in places. There were debris scattered across the surface. The threshold was marked with faded paint that probably hadn't been refreshed since the Cold War. Marcus called out altitude and airspeed. His voice was steady now, a professional doing his job regardless of how he felt about it. Nadia appreciated that. Appreciated that when it mattered, he'd set aside his earlier dismissiveness and become the co-pilot she needed. Behind them in the cabin, Patricia had the passengers in crash position. Heads down, hands braced, the psychological preparation for impact that might or might not come. 185 people trusting that Nadia knew what she was doing, trusting that this wasn't the last few minutes of their lives. The submarine commander's voice crackled through one last time. He said he was surfacing adjacent to the island, that his crew was ready to evacuate, that he was trusting her with proof that could prevent a war or start one, depending on who controlled the narrative. He thanked her for her father's friendship, said that some legacies were worth dying for. Nadia didn't respond. She was too focused on the approach, on the numbers that had to align perfectly or not at all. The runway threshold came up fast, too fast. She pulled back power, dropped landing gear, felt the aircraft settle into the descent profile. The wheels touched concrete with a screech that transmitted through the entire airframe. Immediately she knew they were too fast. The runway was shorter than calculated. The braking surface was compromised. She deployed thrust reversers, stood on the brakes, and felt the aircraft shudder with the strain of physics demanding one outcome while she demanded another. Marcus called out remaining runway. 500 feet. 300, 100. The jungle at the far end was filling the windscreen. Nadia could see individual trees, vines, the green wall that would destroy them if they didn't stop. 50 feet. 25. 10. The aircraft stopped with less than 5 feet of runway remaining. Nadia's hands were shaking now. Marcus was breathing hard. Behind them, the cabin was silent with shock. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Patricia's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional, asking if everyone was all right. Affirmative responses filtered back. No injuries, no damage beyond psychological trauma and the certainty that they just experienced something that would define how they thought about flying forever. Nadia unbuckled and stood. Her legs felt uncertain beneath her. Marcus caught her arm, steadying her. He said that was the most insane piece of flying he'd ever witnessed. That he'd write her up for it if he thought anyone would believe him. She smiled grimly and moved toward the exit. The submarine had surfaced 50 yards offshore. She could see men emerging from the conning tower, carrying waterproof containers. The submarine commander was identifiable by his age and bearing, a man in his 60s who moved with military precision. Hatcher's voice came through her radio, which she'd clipped to her belt. He said the Chinese fighters had broken off but were maintaining position. That she had maybe 10 minutes before this situation escalated beyond his ability to control. That she needed to complete whatever transaction was happening and get back in the air. Nadia opened the forward door. Tropical heat and humidity poured in. The smell of jungle and ocean and aviation fuel. She descended the stairs that had deployed automatically, her feet touching ground that felt surreal after the chaos of the last hours. The submarine commander was wading through shallow water toward the beach. He was alone now, his crew remaining with the vessel. When he reached the shore, he stopped and studied her face. Then he smiled with recognition and sadness. He said she looked like her mother, that he'd known her family when she was a child, that her father had talked about her constantly, proud of what she'd become even as he feared his past would destroy her future. Nadia asked for the evidence. The commander reached into his waterproof case and withdrew a drive, military grade, encrypted. He said it contained everything: design specifications, transaction records, communications between government officials authorizing sales that violated international law, proof that her father had discovered the leak and been eliminated to keep him silent. He said the information would destroy careers, maybe governments, that it would prove multiple nations had been collaborating to profit from weapons technology while publicly advocating for disarmament. That her father had been murdered by people who were supposed to be allies. Nadia took the drive with hands that had stopped shaking. She asked why her? Why bring this to someone who'd left the intelligence world? The commander's answer was simple. He said because she was the only person who couldn't be bought or blackmailed, who had no loyalty except to truth, who would release the information regardless of consequences. Behind her, Patricia appeared at the aircraft door. She called down that they had a problem, that the young man from row 32 was demanding to leave the aircraft, that he was claiming there was a bomb threat and he needed to evacuate immediately. Nadia understood instantly. The observer wasn't trying to leave. He was trying to get close to the submarine commander, to eliminate him before the exchange could be completed. She turned and ran back toward the stairs. Shouted for Patricia to keep everyone aboard, to seal the cabin, but she was too slow. The young man had already pushed past the flight attendants, was descending the stairs with the contained urgency of someone trained for violence. Nadia reached the base of the stairs as he hit the ground. They locked eyes. In that moment she saw recognition. He knew who she was, knew her capabilities, knew this wouldn't be easy. He moved with the efficiency of professional training, hands sweeping beneath his jacket. Nadia didn't think, didn't calculate, just responded with muscle memory from another life. She closed the distance, caught his wrist as the weapon cleared fabric, and used his momentum to redirect. They went down together, hitting the concrete hard enough that pain flared through her shoulder. The weapon skittered away. The young man twisted, trying for leverage. Nadia had 30 pounds on him and 15 years of training that had been beaten into her during Special Operations qualification. She pinned his arm, used her knee to control his movement, and applied pressure to a nerve cluster that made him gasp and go limp. Marcus had descended the stairs, and his expression was one of complete shock. Patricia was right behind him, holding a fire extinguisher like a weapon. The submarine commander watched with the calm of someone who'd seen this kind of violence before. Hatcher's voice crackled through the radio. He said Chinese fighters were inbound again. That he needed her airborne in the next 4 minutes or he couldn't guarantee protection. Nadia looked at the young man beneath her, at his face which showed no fear, only calculation. She asked who he worked for, who wanted the commander dead. He smiled and answered in perfect English. He said it didn't matter, that she just made herself.